The noise arrived before the insult. The first thing I heard was the heavy rhythm of blades cutting the air above the rooftop, a vibration that settled into the concrete and pushed everyone back a step. The pilot lowered the chopper with the confidence of someone who believed the world should pause for his arrival. Heat from the engines brushed my face while loose papers scattered across the platform. Then his voice crashed through the headset. He did not speak to me. He shouted. He barked at me as if I were part of the machinery. His first word carried the tone of a man who never learned the difference between authority and volume. He called me tech with complete certainty and demanded fuel, as if urgency alone created entitlement. People around us froze because they knew what that tone meant. They had heard it many times. I stayed still. I did not argue. I did not correct him. There was no point in challenging a man who believed altitude was a crown. I simply removed the headset and let his impatience ricochet into the open air. The pilot glanced at me, confused by my calm, but I had no intention of explaining anything. I looked up at the chopper, then at the man leaning out of the cabin, gripping the frame as if the rooftop belonged to him. What he did not realize was that he had misread the entire situation. The real authority on that roof was the one who understood the rules beneath the noise. That landing zone wasn't his. He was the kind of CEO who believed height created ownership. Years of stepping out of helicopters onto rooftops had convinced him that the world existed to clear space for his arrival. People rushed when he appeared not because of respect, but because they feared the storm that followed when anything slowed him down. He confused altitude with authority, noise with competence, and urgency with leadership. His reputation had been fed by those who preferred survival over honesty. Inside the company, the culture worked like a silent engine. Nobody challenged him. Titles shielded him. Status carried more weight than truth. Meetings were rehearsed long before he entered the room. Every decision came with a layer of caution because someone had decided long ago that keeping him comfortable was easier than keeping him correct. Over time, that quiet submission built an illusion of ownership around him. He believed every space belonged to him the moment he stepped into it. I had watched this dynamic for years without becoming part of it. I was not a tech, despite what he yelled from the sky. I was not staff in the way he understood it. I was not temporary or replaceable. My position operated above the daily noise of office survival and outside the chain of people forced to nod before speaking. I had responsibilities that lived in paperwork, permits, and liabilities, responsibilities that did not shift when a helicopter descended. He assumed my silence placed me beneath him. In reality, it simply placed me outside his reach. Power built on assumption always lands badly. Long before the helicopter appeared, my work lived in a quieter world. It was a world built on documents that nobody noticed until something went wrong. While he ran the company through loud announcements and hurried demands, I managed the structures that determined what could legally happen on that rooftop. Nothing about my role required raised voices. It required precision. It required patience. It required the kind of understanding that only comes from years of watching how systems behave when they are tested. The permits alone told a long story. They covered airspace routes, fuel restrictions, and emergency protocols that had been updated year after year by people who never stepped into the spotlight. The clearance ledger listed every aircraft allowed to land and the conditions under which they could return. His name appeared in that book, but his permission was conditional, not automatic. He had never asked who signed it. Men like him rarely ask. Then there were the liability maps, thick folders that recorded weight limits, weather history, and risk zones. Those pages held signatures from engineers who built walls strong enough to carry a landing and lawyers who understood how quickly confidence fades when insurance rules are ignored. They were older than him. They were quieter than him. They were far more powerful than his temper. When I stood on the rooftop, I was not thinking about his impatience or his tone. I was thinking about the language written in every document that governed our next decision. That language answered more loudly than he ever could. He saw a rooftop. I saw a contract. The moment had stretched long enough. His voice kept pouring out of the helicopter cabin, sharp and impatient, filling the rooftop with noise that belonged more to habit than authority. The pilot kept glancing at me, waiting for direction, aware that the situation was no longer about fuel or timing. I let the wind settle around us for a brief second, the kind of pause that reminds everyone that noise never decides anything. Then I spoke for the first time. I used a single sentence. No emotion. No raised tone. It was the kind of statement that comes from someone who knows the rules better than the person trying to break them. I announced that his landing clearance had been revoked. Not in anger. Not in defiance. Procedurally. The same way any experienced person handles a decision that carries consequences beyond one man's pride. The pilot straightened immediately. Pilots understand procedure. Pilots respect it. The CEO did not. He erupted inside the cabin. His arms moved in wide gestures. His face turned red under the rotor wash. He shouted questions that had already been answered in documents he had never bothered to read. He accused everyone of incompetence except himself. His outrage filled the cockpit until even the wind seemed quieter than his temper. I remained still. I had no desire to match his volume or his confusion. Age teaches you that silence can hold more weight than force. I simply repeated nothing and let the system speak for me. The power was already shifting, and he was the last person to realize it. Men who scream from helicopters panic when gravity answers back. The moment the clearance was revoked, everything around the helicopter shifted. The blades kept turning, but the sense of movement disappeared. The pilot received the notice through his headset and lowered his hands from the controls with the calm resignation of someone who understood the seriousness of the decision. He informed the cabin that takeoff was no longer permitted. His tone carried no anger, only certainty. That certainty unsettled everyone except me. Inside the helicopter, the CEO reacted as if the air itself had betrayed him. He demanded immediate answers, but none arrived. The pilot refused to lift the aircraft without proper authorization, and every attempt to push him only strengthened the stillness on the rooftop. Calls began. First to assistants, then to operations, then to anyone he believed could restore his momentum. One by one the calls stacked, but nothing changed. The rules he ignored for years had finally stepped into the room. Far below us, lawyers were pulled from sleep to review clauses written long before his leadership. Their opinions carried more weight than his frustration. They confirmed the restriction without hesitation. They advised caution. They advised patience. Neither quality belonged to him. His humiliation deepened not through spectacle, but through the quiet force of procedure. Other pilots on nearby channels refused involvement. They understood the risk. They recognized the liability. Even those who admired him kept their distance. A grounded helicopter is not a crisis. A grounded ego can be. I stood a few steps away and watched the realization settle across his face. For the first time, his authority had nowhere to land. Nothing frightens authority like a system that stops responding. I was nowhere near the boardroom when the call began. I did not need to be. The moment the helicopter was grounded, the situation moved far above the rooftop and into a space where decisions were made quietly and consequences were measured in numbers rather than emotions. While he paced the cabin in frustration, the directors gathered on an emergency line to understand why their CEO was suspended midair on company property without permission to take off. Later, through people who trusted discretion more than loyalty, I learned what unfolded inside that meeting. The first questions were practical. They wanted to know who authorized the flight. They wanted to know whether protocols had been ignored. They wanted to know why the rooftop team had activated risk procedures usually reserved for serious violations. Each answer pointed in the same direction. Then came the financial questions. What would the delay cost? What liability would fall on the company? What potential fines might arise from breaching the insurance conditions linked to that landing zone? Directors who rarely raised their voices began asking why their leader had treated regulated space as personal property. They noticed details they had overlooked for years. Reputations were quietly weighed. Confidence recalculated. The room did not explode. It cooled. When a board cools, someone's influence freezes with it. No one defended his behavior. They simply followed the facts until they reached their natural conclusion. I did not have to speak for him to lose ground. His conduct spoke loudly enough. I didn't embarrass him. He arrived pre-embarrassed. When word spread through the building about what happened on the rooftop, several people expected me to feel triumphant. They waited for a smile or even a quiet moment of satisfaction, something that showed I had finally enjoyed a turn of advantage after years of being treated as if my experience were invisible. But nothing in me reached for celebration. I understood exactly what the situation represented, and it had little to do with victory. At a certain age, you stop chasing the thrill of being proven right. You start valuing the stability that comes from protecting the rules that hold an organization together. This was not revenge. Revenge is loud and emotional. What happened that day was simple boundary enforcement. A man assumed the world would bend because he demanded it. The world, for once, did not. That is not a triumph. It is a correction. I did not walk home with a sense of conquest. I walked home with clarity. I had acted according to procedure, the same procedure that keeps people safe and protects the company from risks far larger than one person's pride. The outcome was the natural result of a system doing what it was designed to do. My role was not to enjoy it, but to uphold it. You reach a stage in life where the measure of a moment is not how loudly it echoes, but how quietly it settles. If it brings order instead of chaos, you are already ahead. That day settled quietly for me. At this age, peace matters more than applause. If you are listening now, understand that this message is meant for those who have carried responsibility long enough to know the weight of silence. You do not need volume to be heard. You do not need titles to validate your presence. Life eventually teaches that credibility comes from how you move when no one is watching. Experience sharpens the ability to act without noise, and age strengthens the instinct to let substance replace performance. You have earned the right to choose when to speak and when to stay quiet. Silence is not weakness at this stage in life. It is strategy. It creates space for judgment that is measured rather than impulsive. The moments that once called for confrontation now call for design. You understand that authority does not come from raising your voice, but from arranging the conditions that shape an outcome long before conflict appears. Leverage begins with understanding access. You decide who enters a process, who remains outside it, and who must wait until the system responds on its own terms. When voices fail, documentation speaks. When tempers rise, procedure holds the line. The strength of a seasoned professional comes from respecting the rules that younger people rush past without reading. Control is rarely about force. It is about building structures that protect your decisions even when others try to challenge them. Remember that influence grows strongest in the quiet moments when you choose structure over reaction, and let the weight of your experience guide decisions others are not prepared to make. People who mistake altitude for ownership always forget one thing: the ground keeps records.